favorite monster Aberration. And aberration is spelled aberrantly because there's one B and two R's in the word aberration. A number of the most famous D&D aberrations have a very long history in the game. They have existed, some of them since the very beginning of published D&D. And I think I want to say, if you can name an aberration, it has a long history in D&D. If you have to think about it for a moment, then it does not have a long history in D&D. In reality, there are probably only two answers to this question. But behind those two, there are two others. I want to say two. Oh well, let's start from the bottom of the list. The one aberration that no one's going to say, or if you do, I'm impressed because it's difficult, is Ishishashitl. Those are vampiric manta ray creatures that live underneath the ocean, and they have existed in D&D since first edition for sure, and possibly since basic D&D. No one ever really uses them because they're entirely aquatic, so you have to be underwater to deal with them. And they're weird, and you can't say their name. But it's the Ixixashitl is just based on... Well, I can't say it's really based on, but to me it seems like it's just pseudo-South American Aztec kind of language. When I think about Aztec mythology or Mayan mythology, that's the kind of letter combinations and sounds that you would get from that. I don't know offhand if there's a real-world analog or inspiration for the Ixixashitl or not. But I remember seeing them when I was a kid, and I'm just like, it's a manta ray. But it's also a vampire. That's awesome! Another one that is on the low end of the list that many people are probably not going to name is the Aboleth. But I would definitely say it's one of the top most recognized aberrations in D&D amongst D&D players. So an aboleth is like a giant amoeba-ish catfish. Like if a catfish and an amoeba had a baby, you would have an aboleth. They are also aquatic. They have to stay in water. But they have they have massive, powerful psionic abilities. And they're able to control people's minds from miles away. They exude a mucus around them, kind of like a lungfish. And if they're in pools or something, this pool will also slowly get filled up with this aboleth snot mucus stuff. And by forcing a creature into the pool and making them kind of like drown in that nasty water, it'll actually turn their skin clear and make them kind of aquatic as well, where like they can't survive outside of water. And so it's a way for an aboleth to kind of trap you there and control you. But I think it also lets you breathe underwater, so it's a way for the aboleth to take you underwater with it in the aquatic area. Kind of overcoming... You can see how it overcomes in a number of ways the downsides of the Ixixashitl when it comes to the a whole aquatic aspect. The problem with aboleths is they have to be very far behind the scenes because it's just a giant snot ball. And so, offhand, I think they don't have that many hit points and they don't have that great of a defense. So you could just destroy one if you got into melee combat with it. But the problem is you never get into melee combat with it because it takes over your mind when you're 5 miles away. They are also the origin of another aberration called a scum, which are servants that the aboleths have, I think, just like engineered over endless eons in the Underdark. But when it comes to the two most I don't want to say popular, but I'll say popular. Two most popular, two most well-known, the two most famous aberrations in D&D. You're talking about beholders, and you're talking about illithids or mind flayers. Every D&D player knows what those creatures are, and people who've never played D&D before sometimes know what those creatures are. They are iconic. In fact, Greyhawk, supplement number 1 for original D&D. They printed the very first edition of D&D, what is often referred to as Old D&D, or LBB for Little Brown Book D&D. They printed the 3 books, and the very first supplement, called Greyhawk, featured a fighter and a beholder on the cover. That's how old school beholders are. They're on book number 4 ever made. They have tons of magical abilities. They are often misrepresented in size between illustrations and text. If you read the text, I want to say as far back as first edition AD&D Monster Manual, they are described as being 6 feet across. But if you look at illustrations of them, they're almost always 3 feet across, which is still gigantic considering that the creature consists of an eyeball and a mouth. A 3-foot beach ball sized creature with just a giant eyeball and a mouth is going to freak you out in real life. Oh, and it also has 10 more eyes on stalks above it. Second edition is when they really started expanding on beholders. Beholders kind of blew up in second edition, and they came out with a set of books/adventures called I Tyrant, and it was IEYE. And beholders are also known as I Tyrants. But they came up with a bunch of alternate versions of the beholder. The one that you normally see, which is just the big round ball with the central anti-magic eye, the tooth-filled mouth, and the 10 different ray attack eye beams, is just like the normal common beholder. But then there is also like the death beholder. There's the beholder mage that gouges out its own central anti-magic eye to increase the abilities of its eye rays. There's a beholder that has claws, like big lobster claws, so it's like the only beholder with hands. There's all kinds of different beholders in the second edition monster manuals, and folios, monster folios, I believe. And they also, in I Tyrant, I believe, mention a gigantic beholder, and I want to say it's a queen, but I'm not entirely certain on that. But just like the Uber Beholder that also lives underground. Beholders are cool because they're one of the few creatures that they don't magically float. You would think that beholders would float in the air by way of magic, but they don't. They actually float in the air completely naturally. So if you were to use, like, dispel magic on a beholder, it doesn't fall to the ground and roll along. It continues to float in the air. Another great book, because the popularity of beholders carried from second edition into third edition. And third edition, I want to say it was in the 3.5 era, but it was somewhere right in the middle, released a book called Lords of Madness. And it was a book that detailed aberrations. They also had a book about undead, which I can't remember the name of. And they had a book on horror, which was called Heroes of Horror, which was also a really good source book. But Lords of Madness was awesome because it wrote up entries on a number of different aberrations as though they were real and tried to explain in kind of scientific ways how they exist and how they work. So there's inside of Lords of Madness, there's a picture of a beholder, a side view, and it's cut in half. So just like you'd see a human body and it would show you where all the organs are and everything, there's one for the beholder showing you here's its mouth, and here's its stomach and intestines and stuff, and here's its brain, and here's its air bladder that allows it to float constantly and things like that. And it's really cool and it talks about the society and the psychology and everything about the beholders, and it follows along completely like they're real creatures. Now, considering that when the beholder was created, it was just kind of made up, this book demonstrates one of my favorite things to do, which is to take some random situation. I often do it with characters when I roll up a background on a random background generator and making sense of it. Take this randomly generated background and somehow weave it together into a cohesive whole. So these guys who wrote Lords of Madness took everything that they knew about beholders from all the various editions, and you know how old the beholder is, and wove it together into this weird cohesive whole. Nothing makes me... Lords of Madness actually also does the Aboleth as an entry, and the only time I ever felt like using an Aboleth as a monster in a game was after reading Lords of Madness. I thought they were the stupidest creatures before that. If I remember, though, they do not do the Ixixarcitl. I know I've said that probably 3 different ways each time. However, the Illithid, in comparison to the Beholder, would probably win out in most people's voting. The Illithid also has a very long history in D&D. It was present in the very first AD&D monster manual, and it was also like the Ixixarcitl, one that I looked at and thought it looked ridiculous. You have a guy with an octopus for a head. Ooh, scary. But over time, they have been so developed in the lore of D&D, not just the fiction books, but the adventure modules and the monster manuals, and Lords of Madness again, covers all kinds of aspects of illithids and mind flayers, and how they came to be, the way that they reproduce, they made a move in that book to kind of go over how cruel and how sadistic and how evil they are. For example, all throughout an illithid city, you're going to have like stocks. And at certain, like, they'll have an amphitheater, and in the middle of the amphitheater there's a stage, and on the stage there's stocks. Stocks being those boards with the 3 holes, so you stick the person's head and 2 hands in, and then you put the board down and lock them. I think there's a pillory, I think, is another name for it. And they'll talk about how there's one of those on the stage, and what'll happen is at certain times of the day or certain times of the week, there's a show that gets put on, and they bring out one of their slaves and lock them into the stocks or the pillory, and then the illithid who puts on the show takes his time to execute the perfect brain extraction. And some of the shows, if I remember correctly from the book, some of the shows, the point is to do it to exercise their mind control powers to such a degree that the victim never makes a move. So they sit there completely still. They never show a twitch or a twinge or any kind of pain or anything as the illithid sticks its tentacles into its head and rips its brain out. And other times it's the exact opposite, and the whole point is to keep the victim alive as long as possible and cause as much excruciating pain and screaming and hollering and twisting and as possible before finally removing the brain. So there's a lot of backstory that goes in there, and Lords of Madness is a creepy book if you ever read it. I did see a Lords of Madness book in a like $50 bookstore once, so I know that they're out there. My brother has a copy, and I'm very happy for that. All that said, I've just spent 14 minutes talking about 4 other aberrations. I'm sure there's plenty of other aberrations that come to mind, but the one that sticks out to me, and I've mentioned this before, I know for sure in my videos, my favorite D&D monster of all time is the Carrion Crawler. It is intellectual property, so it belongs to the D&D brand, just like illithids, just like beholders. They are all created for D&D. And so if you go online to, for example, the SRD, the system reference document for D20 games, it has all the rules and all the monsters, but not beholders, not illithids, and not carrion crawlers. Those are D&D intellectual property. But the carrion crawler, if you go back to the very first edition AD&D, the picture was creepy as all get out, and I loved it. And you have this monster that gets like a bunch of attacks, and they all paralyze you, and then it does crap for damage when it bites you. But who cares? Because you can't move, so it can sit there and gnaw on you as long as it takes. The second edition illustration was not as good in my opinion, but was still decent, and it made it a little bit more insectile and a little less alien, I felt. The third edition and fourth edition illustrations are crap. Whoever created those, I want to punch them in the face and take away any ability, break their hands, really. They should never be doing art again, because they look silly. They look goofy. They look stupid. And they lost all of the alien insectile appearance that they've had through first edition and second edition, and just made them these goofy cartoon creature looking things, and I hate it. But the Carrion Crawler is by far my favorite D&D creature of all time. Just in case that ever... Oh, great. Favorite monster overall. Well, we'll come back to that. I'll talk about my second favorite monster overall in that spot, since that type of creature doesn't show up. So yes, overall, Carrion Crawler is my very favoritist creature, and it also is an aberration, so it is my favorite aberration. And I guess we'll end it there. So until tomorrow, bye-bye.